The four of you might be on camera, having a discussion, and then when one of you starts talking in more detail, it'll go to full screen on you on the thing. So that's what's there. Just be aware that because it's a panel discussion, even if you aren't talking, you could very well be sitting there being, nodding away, listening to the response. So be aware of that point. The other thing is in the bottom middle, there's a chat icon. If you could please click on that. face will appear, and
Okay.
that's it. Good morning, everyone.
So when I see my face, I can launch into my good morning and welcome to today's webinar, which forms a part of our EY integrity agenda.
Exactly that.
That's right. Kate, just a quickie. I'm in Glissa,
Please don't
but
tell me that's...
it's just got 2 sessions on there. The previous 2, not the live one.
Yeah, so I haven't set it live yet.
Ah, okay, fine.
As soon as I get the go ahead, I can click live.
Okay,
And then
cool.
it will appear in the on now tab.
Right, okay.
So the 2 other sessions are the previous ones that
That's
are
right.
available on demand.
Fine, I'll keep a look out then.
I'm in the back end, Nick,
Are
and
you, Chloe?
I can see it. Focus on
Oh.
culture.
If it's okay, I'm going to make a cup of coffee.
Okay. Yes,
Please
please.
All right.
I'm going to go into it again.
Likewise, I might do that as well. Or do you need me? Is my Wi-Fi okay? I feel like it was a bit fragile for a moment there.
Yeah, Laurie, to be totally honest, fragile is probably the right word. Every now and again, it sort of glitches or drops. Not enough that I would say we've got a major problem, but it does glitch every now and again.
Odd. I'll go check the router.
Thank you.
Bear with me.
Okay, I'm in it now. It says video unavailable. Restricted mode enabled.
Sorry, Nick, what are you saying? You talking
Sorry,
to
I'm in
Kate?
Glissa. Yeah, Kate.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which forms part of our EY Integrity Agenda, a series of 60-minute briefings focused on thematic areas of keen interest for our EY clients and boards. Today's session is focused on culture, and I'm your host for the next hour. My name's Laurie Gorley. I'm a client service partner in the EY sustainability team, and I advise boards in heavily regulated markets on all things related to sustainability, which includes environmental, social, and governance issues and opportunities. So naturally, for me, culture plays a key role in the success and performance of companies to ensure that they are purpose-driven and foster conditions that create long-term value for society. In a personal capacity, I'm also the chair of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland Ethics Board and vice chair of the Board of Trustees of the Institute of Business Ethics. So as your host today, it's going to be my aim to have an interactive discussion, not only with our esteemed speakers, but also our audience. So please do ask questions, put them in the chat function, and I'll do my best to address as many questions as I can. So for the next 60 minutes, I'm delighted now to introduce you to our esteemed panelists. With me today, I have Judith Akinosho, Peter Elam, and Miriam Hussein. So as your host, please might I invite our panelists to introduce themselves and offer some opening reflections on why culture is important to them, not only from a business perspective, but also personally. Judith, Peter, Miriam, please may I offer you introductions.
Thank you, Laurie. I think I'll go first, and good morning to everyone who's taken the time to join us this morning. I'm Judith Akinosho, as Laurie mentioned. I am based in London. I work for ByteDance TikTok as head of ethics for the EMEA region. Prior to joining ByteDance, I was at S&P Global Platts as Chief Compliance Officer. I took that company through regulation as parts of the business became increasingly regulated. I've worked across several sectors, including the energy sector, where I was working on complex multi-geographic compliance issues and exposed to quite a number of cultural issues as well. I'm a lawyer by training, and I started my career in private practice. I think in preparing for this forum, I'd given some thought to what culture is. And I think quite simply for me, it's the sum total of attitudes and values and goals that a company has, and that reflects why it does what it does and why it takes the decisions that it takes. And this is not just at the board level or the management level, but also for employees, i.e., why should I do it? Why shouldn't I do it? And I think that with culture, it's very much a personal value-based approach. We all have values. And the question is, when you're in a corporate environment, how do you mesh those together so that you're moving towards a shared goal? So I think that for business success, you have to have a meeting of the minds on your values, on your culture. And then as an individual, you really should only be with companies that share your value set. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation to hear from others in different industries and in the course of their career, how they think we've got to this point in 2022 where we have to ask ourselves, what is culture? Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Peter?
Thanks, Laurie. So I'm Peter Elam. I'm Group Head of Risk Management and Business Assurance at Anglo American, which is a global mining company. I also have responsibility for ethical business conduct within my remit. I'm also president of the Chartered Institute of Internal Auditors in the UK and Ireland. And my interest in culture really goes back quite a long time. I mean, I'm fortunate that I've lived in 10 different countries in my life, 5 different continents. I speak a number of languages, and so I'm quite used to seeing the same thing from different perspectives and understanding that different cultures may have starkly different attitudes. People may have starkly different attitudes to the same thing. In a corporate context, I've been through some cultural crises, I would say. So at Shell, I was there during the the hydrocarbon reserves reporting crisis in 2004, when the share price dropped to 20% because of misreporting of hydrocarbon reserves. Shell eventually pleaded guilty to reporting fraud. I was also at Novartis for 8 years, and the pharma industry has many ethical dilemmas, and few pharma companies have completely come out of those without any fines or penalties. And so within Anglo American, a global mining company, there are plenty of ethical dilemmas today. So I like very much the topic of culture, find it very interesting. And in my work, very much trying to see how culture informs the outcomes that we see in day-to-day activity.
Thank you, Peter. Miriam?
Thank you. So good morning and a very warm welcome to everyone. My name is Mariam Hussain. I'm a partner in the Forensic and Integrity Services team at EY. And my perspective on the topic is based on having spent 23 years of my professional life investigating large-scale misconduct around the world. So all sorts of misconduct, from mis-selling to financial manipulation to large-scale fraud and corruption. And having investigated those types of cases across different sectors, not just different countries. So from financial services, energy, pharma, global corporations to organizations like the agencies of the United Nations. And many of those cases ended up in the public domain. And what struck me over this period of time is that as these scandals break, often really at quite an early stage, there's already a story that's sort of half written. And it's all about the fact that there was something inherently wrong with these people or this person that engaged in this behavior, that phrase bad apples or a group of bad apples. And it was clear to me as an investigator that it's not the othering of these people, they're not people like us, doesn't correspond to the reality. And there was something about the culture and the leadership that they were experiencing that was a key factor in creating an environment for people to make the decisions that they did and made the choices that they did. So I became a bit obsessed about the topic of organizational culture and behavior, so much so that I went back to university 5 years ago to do a master's in behavioral science. And now I'm focused on how do we bring those insights, scientific insights, in influencing organizational culture to enable ethical decision-making. And in particular, my lens on definition of culture in this context is what is the social norms? What is it that employees experience that enables them to justify certain types of behavior and do what they do and still feel okay about it?
So as your host, please may I just ask an opening question around best practices. So from all of your collective experience, perhaps we start with culture as an enabler for high performance and for delivering good exemplar outcomes for a company. And then as we move through the discussion, perhaps we flip over to the notion of how and why do sometimes we get it wrong. So in the first instance, please can I ask you, Peter, and then Judith, just for some reflections on best practices based on all of your experience, best practices on good culture.
So in the corporate context, it's really important that the board and the senior executive very consciously set the culture and values expectations within the organization. That's a UK Corporate Governance Code requirement, but it's also a requirement for running an effective organization. By that, what I mean is that it's established usually through quite extensive dialogue. What are the key values for the company? And what does that mean in practice day to day? In order to do that reliably, it's very important to have dialogue quite far into the organization and understand what kind of dilemmas people face so that you can make the values relevant. And also, obviously, to check whether any of the values maybe have a sort of discordant meaning or suggestion in some of the key local cultures. So, for instance, at Novartis, we like to talk sometimes about transparency, but if you start talking about transparency in South America, that carries the connotation of corruption. So it's not helpful to talk about transparency. And similarly, you really have to check that the words that you're using resonate well with people in the organization. In terms of enablers, I'd like to pick on two that are quite current for us. In Anglo-American, we're very much trying to improve speak up culture. And what that means is that people feel more comfortable to voice their views, their concerns. And with that, we're trying to promote better inclusion in the workplace. Now, on the one hand, that's a welfare issue. People generally feel better if they're kind of listened to and respected for who they are. But it's also very much a performance issue because on complex topics, you generally can't find the optimal or the most sustainable solution without listening to a wide range of views. It's very unlikely that the decision maker on their own would be able to chart a sustainable course without listening to a wide variety of views. And we really believe that speak up, inclusion, diversity that goes with that are actually very important business and performance enablers.
I'm going to pick up on something Peter said at the beginning around the fact that there's expectation at the board level and at the management level. And what I see that is best practice, and perhaps this is going to be slightly controversial, that's the fact that compliance professionals don't own ethics solely. They don't have sole accountability for an ethical culture. And I think if we get into a mindset where we think we have to convince the business, we have it wrong. So if you think through the whole ecosystem from the board, who have expectations of the management and the managers at the middle and all the way through, we all have accountability for ethical culture. So I think that's what I know in my experience going many, many years ago now, probably maybe 12 years to my time at GE, was that each employee owns culture and owns ethics. And the fact that you're empowering people to say you don't have to have a title to own ethics or to be an ethical ambassador or to act the right way is very empowering for people. And that's something in that organization that had or has a best-in-class compliance program was it's owned by everyone. So just the concept of it's not some folk in some room, it's what I do every day. And I think coming back to what I enable as, it's the openness of comms, so communications, right? That's the first bit. If you're open about expectation, if you're open about lessons learned, you're pushing the dial in the right direction. The other point I'd like to make, it kind of going back, actually, let me stay on the point of ownership. It's benchmarking managers, right? So if I say I'm running a program, Peter spoke about the Speak Up hotline. Those are some enablers around, are we seeing a trend from this function or this team? Are you talking about it in your meetings with your teams? And we're benchmarking when, say, for example, we do a Speak Up workshop, right? It's global. How many people have attended across which functions? I'm not just going to say we have 22,000 employees and we had maybe 10,000 people and that was great. No. Where did they come from? Who are the leaders who encourage their teams to attend? When you start to benchmark leadership to say, okay, the CFO was really strong in attending and we don't see technology showing up at all, you start to have real conversations at the leadership level to say, my team is great, I take accountability for it. And I think the last comment I would make around openness of communications and lessons learned, right? There's a debate around, so we think about how a program runs. Training and communications is a big piece of it, right? When you do your newsletters and you do your communications to the business, do you share information about where we've gone wrong internally in the company? And that's a debate I have with colleagues across functions. You might have folk in the PR team thinking, what are you doing? It's going to get out in the press. And you have the legal team thinking about the risk about it. HR is saying, what of the confidentiality? And then we end up in a space where we say, we're just perfect, we're just great. But for a lot of colleagues that we serve, it rings a bell when you say, we made this mistake and this is how we fix it. So to kind of close out, it would be two things. One, we're benchmarking across leadership. There's an openness of communication, and then we're just making sure accountability for an ethical culture belongs to everyone, not one function. That was long, but that's my thoughts around it.
Thank you, Judith. There's one point, there's two sides of the speak up coin, in my opinion. There's the speak up element, but then there's the listen up element. Any reflections from the panelists on this notion of active listening? You've touched a little bit on it, Judith, but I'd welcome views from Peter, Miriam, just on listening.
Well, I mean, I think the simplest answer to that is that we have one mouth and two ears, and we should act in proportion to that. In other words, listen twice as much as we speak. And in my experience, the speak up doesn't work if people are not prepared, if the leaders are not prepared to listen. And what we now talk more about psychological safety, which is very much a leadership responsibility about setting the environment that people feel able to speak up. And by the way, when I talk about speak up, I mean day-to-day speak up, as well as using the hotline, which we also have for potential misconduct.
So to build on that, I would say listening at an individual level and then listening at a collective level, because there will be an emerging picture from all of those voices, and to give consideration to that. The second point is to give consideration to the voices that we're not hearing. And organizations are constantly trying to provide channels and opportunities so that people can raise their voice, but to also pay attention to the areas where we're not hearing people's voices, and to think about how to enable that.
Thank you. I'm just looking at the chat here. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. So one is around accountability and owning the culture. And the question relates to, how do we see hybrid remote working impacting accountability, as well as challenges around fostering an effective culture? Judith, I might offer you that question.
Right. So I'm happy to take this one, because it's one that I've experienced, having changed roles during my during lockdown, right? And I think that it goes back to recognizing that as an ethics and compliance professional, you may not be the only one best placed to solve for this. It might be HR who's best placed. It might be organizational culture team who's best placed. So if we think about the remote environment, two things come to mind. One is the connection with your manager is more important than ever, right? It's having a manager who you're able to raise concerns to, is having a manager who actually knows what the policies and culture and values of that company are. So if we think about I don't know where everyone on the call is joining from, but we could be in so many different homes right now versus just being maybe in one office. So how I see, the hybrid work environment impacting a speak up culture, or owning the ethical culture, is that employees are more introspective just by virtue of your home. So you have to figure things out a little bit more on your own. And that's where it becomes even more important that your values are meshed with your company's values. And that's also where, thinking practically, processes have to make sense. So people, who, I think Miriam was saying, she's seen stuff where, maybe things go wrong and people think the problem was that person. It could be the process. It could be the procedures. So it means that as an ethics compliance professional, you almost have to put yourselves in the shoes of the employee who's working at home or who's traveling between work. What are your reimbursement policies? Well, it has to be simplified. Whatever you're doing that makes it 2, 3, 4, 5 steps, bring it all the way back, simplify it. But we can't do that alone. We have to work with HR, IT, managers as well. So I would say it's really around looking at the framework. So people don't work in a vacuum. Where could they possibly go wrong? It goes back to what their role is, what the processes are, and just being more focused on the new risks that we're seeing. There will be challenges, but I think simplification is the way forward.
Thank you. Peter, I have a question here that I think is relevant for you, and it relates to establishing a new fraud and risk audit committee within an organization. So how do you establish this structure? And then secondly, from a terms of reference, terms of engagement, any tips on best practices on getting support from the broader senior management team on this origination process?
So when you're looking at culture, I think first of all, you have to have a sense of what culture is expected in the organization, and there needs to be some kind of benchmark. where that people know is the expected culture in the organization. I think without that, it's very difficult to establish any governance, any auditing activity, because people need to have an accepted sense of what is and what isn't expected. Otherwise, it becomes all very, very relative. I think once you have that, you can then look at well, what are the risks against that? So what are the geographies where we operate? What is the nature of our industry? Where we can then recognize the risks of fraud or other forms of misconduct, should we call it? And then having done that, it's possible to set up, first of all, some form of escalation, both formal and informal. So the formal would be a speak up line or a whistleblowing hotline. That's very important. People need to have a protected way of escalating things. And then an informal escalation route where they can kind of call somebody who's working in ethics and compliance and discuss their dilemmas. And then lastly, really the governance piece is where things can be brought to a recognized group of leaders. It's very important to have leaders from the line as well as leaders from ethics and compliance to talk through some of the dilemmas that are faced, maybe some of the investigations cases that there are, some of the results of those, any patterns, and in some cases that committee may also consider disciplinary measures for people who of whom misconduct has been substantiated through an investigation. I mean, I'm mentioning a kind of range of things. I don't think there is a sort of single solution or single set of issues that such a governance group should look at. I think it depends a bit on what you already have in your organization. But these are the kind of elements that you should expect to set up overall within the organization.
Helpful. Miriam, any reflections from you?
I think maybe I will link it to another question that I can see coming up around metrics and measurements, because once you've set up these structures, then what are the metrics and measurements that you would want to look at in order to see how you're progressing? Make this observation around that I think obviously there's a general understanding now that there's the impact of organizational culture on behavior. But the challenge with measurement is that culture is a characteristic of a human system, which is a complex adaptive system. So what that means is that everything is connected to everything else, and many of the connections can't be known. So the internet is an example of a complex adaptive system. So any measure that treats that as like some sort of engineering problem, this is where we are, this is what we want to get to, here's 5 things to measure along the way, is not suited to the reality of that sort of human system. And in that context, bringing about change becomes not about strict control and very specific metrics. It's about understanding those connections and changing the linkages and seeing how the culture shifts. And by the way, because of entanglement of everything, any intervention will have some sort of unintended consequence as well. So having that broader picture. So to come to like and I'll give an example of that. Over the past 12 months, I've helped 2 global organizations in relation to accounting matters, accounting misstatement issues. And what's emerged in that context, what had developed over time, is a total interconnection between the finance and accounting function and the sales and marketing function, such that they both talked about financial performance in the same terms. And what that meant was that when the finance and accounting function was coming to make accounting estimates, they did that with a consideration of the impact that it would have on the financial results. Now, what would have been one of the things that would have been evident if you were looking at it is all the euphemisms and the terminology that was used around the particular types of accounting entries. So that would be a lead indicator of potential misconduct in the future. So why do I give that example? I want to give a couple of examples of practical ways in which you could start building some measurements which are reflecting the complexity of the system. One is driving analogies, looking in the rear view, one is kind of looking forward. The first one is using what's called a Bayesian statistical network model, which is multifaceted. And the purpose is to indicate areas in a global organization where the probability of misconduct is heightened. So this approach builds a learning model with data points. So a pilot we're building with a client right now is that they've taken data points which relate to individual factors, local business factors, and organizational factors. So those may include things like tenure of individuals, HR engagement scores for the local business, and organizational factors in terms of how the business is recording certain types of things in global systems. Now, what this model builds is a probability map of heightened risk of non-compliance. It's going to improve over time as it learns, and you kind of what's built now is going to be very different in terms of the quality of output to 6 months, a year time. The benefit of this approach is that you're using data you already have. You don't have to create any data, and it's a scientifically robust approach. It's not sort of taking one measure as cause and effect. The second practical approach is sort of measuring the disposition of a culture as a lead indicator to non-compliance. So Peter alluded to having a dialogue with the organization. Judith talked about the ecosystem. It's about how do you really hold a mirror to the organization and get to experiencing the organization in the shoes of the employees. And the problem with usual surveys is that it's very difficult to reflect the complexity of reality. So if you ask a question, what is more important to you, getting the job done or following the rules? The answer is often like, it depends. So if you ask 1,000 employees to share a short example where they felt this tension and they indexed it based on what was their dominating motivation, you get the objectivity of statistics with the persuasive power of narratives. And there are various sort of app-based platforms in which you can do that. So both of these methods, from a measurement perspective, have the benefit of being science-based, and they enable you to build a picture over time. And that is critical because, of course, culture is not static. It's evolving, and it's something that you need to measure and keep an eye on over time.
Thank you, Miriam. There's several questions coming in the chat, and one relates actually to benchmarking. Judith, reflections on benchmarking, please.
Thanks, Laurie. I think that's a great question, on how we benchmark across leaders. And I think I'll set this scene before I kind of respond to this. So this is February 2022. It's 2 years of however long this pandemic has gone on. And it feels as if we're coming out of what we've been coming out of and things seem new. But if we reflect back to when many years ago, where we had a lot of regulatory activities around FCPA, UK Bribery Act, and so on, it felt like there was this cultural movement. And I mentioned all of this to say that if you run an ethics and compliance program, nothing has really changed. So if you think about it from expectations of the regulators, you're doing your training, you're writing your policies, you're ensuring that you're doing risk management, your whistleblowing hotline is still going. All of those are key practical ways of running a program and measuring if what your culture is, whatever it is reflective of your program reflects that. So when I think about benchmarking in even training and policy improvement, there's a management, there are leadership teams, there are middle managers. All of those people lead people. And inherently, as human beings, we're quite competitive. And, there's a good industry colleague of mine, Christy, who's written a book about being a wildly effective compliance officer. She'll love this shout out. And he talks about what motivates people. Some people want to do the right thing. Some people think it's a business advantage. Some people just don't want to get into trouble. So everyone is motivated by something. So if each of the people listening to this think of their organizations, their stakeholders, their leaders, there's that element of, I want to be good at what I do. So when you have when you have interactions with your stakeholders and you're saying, hey guys, we're launching the code of conduct in such and such time, and we want everybody to sign up to it. It's about engaging those gears of, oh, and by the way, we're going to be reporting on which function finished first. And it's just simple metrics and dashboarding as far as training and use of the hotline and splicing and dicing the data in a way that gives some cultural indication. So kind of at the beginning, I said nothing has changed, but everything has changed. But the framework of your program is still running the way it is. And it's just about leveraging the, this is how you do compared to X. And you'll be surprised at how motivated people are. I think it's like all of this will be set against the backdrop of your organization. Do they care? And I think that they do care and boards care. And more importantly, what I found, just thinking back to the 2 years, your employees care as well. Someone spoke about employee views. So one of the things we've done recently is not just doing a leadership pulse or check or poll. It's we did an employee survey of the ethical culture. And sometimes what you hear from people is different from what the leaders are saying. Leaders might say, oh, there's too much training. But the employees are saying, I want to hear more from my leaders about this ethical topic. And that was a light bulb moment for them to say, oh, I need to still walk the floor. Yes, you do. People have high expectations. So I think overall, we should think back to what are we doing this for? Why is the business running? Who are our customers and what are the expectations for us? I think the big takeaway for me the last couple of years has been employees, an activist group, and their views are very strong and they're shaping the direction of the ethics programs and the culture as well. So long story short with benchmarking is splice and dice whatever you already have in your program and present that in a way that shows one function, one manager, one geography against the other. It might seem petty, but you'll be surprised at the inherent drivers for people who are competitive.
Thank you, Judith. I'm going to open this next question to all panelists, and I'm going to start with Peter, then Miriam, then Judith. It's a bit of a provocative question, if I can say that. So I'm just going to read it verbatim. So a member of the audience has said that recently a senior manager told them that they actively helped organizations not to be compliant with a particular legislation when the organization told them that's what they wanted. So this individual in the audience was surprised and disappointed, and they're asking you all for insights on how you would respond to the senior leader who told them that. Peter, I'll come to you first.
I think it's a brilliant question and a really, really nice example, because I think we've all seen this, you know, to one degree or another in the environments that we operate, if not people who are helping the organization break or evade the law, but people who are maybe helping find the little nooks and crannies between the laws, right? But let me answer the question directly. So this is somebody who is helping the organization or organizations, I think it was said in the question, go against the law. Now that cannot be acceptable. I can't think of any organization, any company that would tolerate actually breaking the law. And I would, if I came across that, I would probably need to raise it as a speak up case, because and let me explain why. So that would be explicitly breaking what one of our values or constraints, and as I said, I think this would apply to all organizations, but it would be of real interest to investigate why this person is doing that, not only to kind of hopefully put a stop to it, but also to get underneath about why does this person think that that's a good thing to do for themselves, right? And presumably, as you alluded in the question, somebody's asking them to do that. So you need to know not only why the person is doing it, but also why are other people asking them to do that? What is going on? And it's a big opportunity to investigate that, because for every misconduct, there is usually an incentive, and there are often social incentives, and that those that exist is often more interesting to find out about why than it is to find out whether the individual engaged in misconduct or not. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it's a fantastic example. And yeah, I'd love to hear Judith's and Mariam's perspective.
Mariam?
So everything Peter said, and in the context of a incident that I remember so vividly, even though it's a long time ago now, it's many years ago, we were looking at sales and marketing of particular pharma product in a country, but not because there'd been an issue raised, but because there was a compliance review being conducted. In the course of our review, we found marketing and promotional materials that were promoting this particular medicine for indications for which it was not licensed. The control, you will recognize as anyone from a pharma familiar with the background, that a normal control is to have the medical director sign off on all the materials, because the medical director is not, is not part of the sales team. They're not incentivized in the same way. And I have such a clear memory of being in the office of the medical director and asking him the question that Peter is asking, why? Because he'd explicitly signed off. And he said, because the condition for which we are now promoting this in this country is prevalent. And I know enough to know that it works. And I'm not going to wait for the licensing and indication. I feel it's my moral responsibility and duty for us to get the products to the people that need it. You will notice I'm not even identifying what the indications are, because it would identify, and it really was a grey area, and there was really a significant body of evidence, and the organization did anticipate to get the indication very soon, which it did in fact. So that's when you're sitting in the grey area. Why are you doing this? Why are you breaking that law? And nothing from the outside will tell you. It's only the story and the narrative of the person making that decision that gives you an indication.
So I'm going to pick up on that real quick. I think this probably is a dilemma that many ethics and compliance leaders face, where there might be a different business perspective to an issue. I don't quite know the details if this is a flat out, you've pushed the issue to the wire from a legal perspective, or if this is a question of risk tolerance. I'd say after many years of doing this, I'm not surprised by anything I hear by any leaders. And so my approach is typically this. I'm thinking back to some experiences I've had. The first one is to probe. And I don't mean just that individual, it's everyone around them. Oh, by the way, did you know, or understand from X, so probe. That is part of our questions in this I wouldn't even say semi-independent. We are independent to ask the questions. And then when I think through to business perspectives and motivations, I think there's an element of we have to work with legal to understand what is the risk here. We have to work with PR. I'll give two quick examples really, and then I'll wrap up on this one. So there are times when outside of an investigation, you have a very strong view on how maybe discipline approach should be. Or for your business, if you think about sanctions, should we continue to be in this country? Or is there some exemption or license we could apply for? Ultimately, I consider what we do to be an advisory role. It's flagging up the risk, it's having the conversations. And when you don't feel comfortable kicking it up the line. So I've kicked things up in the past all the way into the enterprise risk committee or into the board committee where we say, yes, we're going into this particular deal and we forgot to do X. Do we go back or do we go forward? There are things where, and I don't know if this has been overly pragmatic, but it's also about where does the risk sit? Once you've flagged it up, once you've advised, once you've documented your position, the decision is ultimately the business or the businesses. So what I would do in this kind of scenario would be to probe upwards. I think asking the questions, even if it's uncomfortable, is always the right approach to take.
So Laurie, if I may, I'd like to come back on the dilemma, the situation that Mariam describes, where a chief medical officer is helping or signed off promotion of a product that has not been permitted in the country. I think it's a really nice example, because for me that's a true dilemma. Kind of breaking the law for personal advantage is not really a dilemma. It's kind of just breaking the law. But where you have an opportunity to do something that may serve one of the purposes of your organization, while potentially coming up against another constraint. I think that's a real dilemma, and that if it's not, I mean, I think there are two stages to answering that one. The first is to check, well, what does the policy say about that particular dilemma? Is that described in the policy, and to good enough quality? And if not, it's really important to escalate the dilemma further up, to go to senior management, and if necessary, to go to the board and say, hey, look, we've got a problem here. The staff in our company, on the one hand, want to promote patient welfare. On the other hand, we work in certain jurisdictions where maybe the regulator is very, very slow, may even, by the way, be corrupt or believed to be corrupt. So we may believe the regulator is not serving the interests of even the population as a whole, let alone this group of patients. So how do we deal in that situation? That's a really, really nice topic to try to discuss, because otherwise, particularly in a large multinational organization, there's a risk that dilemmas get kind of either get trapped or even sometimes suppressed down in the organization and never surfaced and never dealt with. And the risks that are posed with them may not be recognized until something really, really bad happens, either to a patient or through regulatory enforcement. The company gets into prosecution or big fines. So I think I think that's the true substance of work for ethics and compliance professionals, is really to try to bring out these dilemmas and try to find constructive, helpful answers to them in dialogue with senior leadership. Because it's not for the ethics professional to say whether, in my view at least, but Mariam and Judith may see it differently. In my view, it's not for the ethics professional to say this is ethical, this is not ethical. That's not very helpful. It's more a navigator, an informed navigator through some of these dilemmas.
There's a question here around processes and ethics not necessarily being a fixed process. And what I'm hearing is that there's shades of gray almost in the example, Mariam, that you've given, tension between purpose and outcomes and so forth. I'd welcome a few more reflections from you, Judith, and then Mariam, just around this, the psychological safety that Peter opened up with, and the need for discussion, because the shades of gray do exist, and it's not always, black or white on what is the right thing to do in any given circumstance. So this process versus discussion tension.
Got it. I think what's more important than anything else to be a successful, effective compliance ethics professional is understanding the business you work for. And that requires you sometimes to sit in stuff that is not, especially if you're a lawyer perhaps, or an accountant, or whatever your background is, it's not natural to you, but you have to understand the team you're working with, whether it's sales, whether it's technology, whether it's operations. Otherwise, you are not connecting with them on a level that makes sense for them. Many moons ago, I was involved in acquisition integrations, and it's almost important that it's impossible to be successful if you don't know the business, right? So in terms of processes, it always makes sense to, one, not sit outside of the day-to-day, but sit in the process. So if you think about not adopting a one-size-fits-all, even within the same organization, the risk that or the issues that one function deals with is different to the other. So you can't take a one-size-fits-all approach. So even how you talk to them, the terms you use when you speak to a sales marketing person, your language has to be different to if you speak to someone who's maybe on the tech side of things. So thinking about processes not being ethical one way or another, it's about the decision making. Is it processes or is it decision making? For this particular task that I'm involved in, what do I need to be thinking about? So let me give an interesting example where I think we've just finished some. Okay, well, the Olympics are going on. We've just finished some different sporting activities. Think of all the different sponsors and companies and how they allocate those tickets. maybe it's as a sales activity, it's a goodwill activity, right? And they approach you to say, how do we do this in an ethical way? You need to think through, what is the purpose of buying tickets for this event? What are we trying to achieve? You know the framework, you know about the potential bribes and giving things of value, but how do you work with them in a way where they're able to see that, yes, I can give gifts to a bona fide client, but I can't give it to one where we're trying to win business from. So ultimately, it's about dialogue, but it's also about understanding, in my view, the drivers for the person you're talking to. And taking a one-size-fits-all approach will never work. So it takes more time out of you as an ethics compliance professional, especially if you have a very lean team, but you can't solve what you don't understand. So for me, the ask would be, work with your business to understand what their processes are before you embed yourself into it.
Just want to pick up on that phrase, Judith, you can't solve what you can't understand. I think that needs to be gold plated. And I think this is an excellent question, just a reminder of a question, which is what happens when the processes need to be changed because the processes themselves support unethical conduct. And I think, assuming that the process wasn't designed to do that, it was designed to with good faith to support proper conduct. I want to give a couple of examples, which talks to understanding the why the conduct is happening. So I talked about the ability to gather lots of micro narratives across an employee population. I think that's particularly useful when you have persistent types of issues, because you really haven't got to the core of what's driving it. In this case, the problem was, why do we continue to have safety incidents when we have, to the point, all these processes, all these rules in place? We've talked about every eventuality as an organization. Why do we keep having problems? And actually what emerged from all these stories of people on the front line to do this point, actually dealing with this, is because there were so many processes and rules and regulations, but the situation on the ground was changing so fast, they were actually paralyzed by this. And what it meant was they didn't make the decisions in a timely way, and they ended up with safety issues. So then the process and the policy was changed, whereby two people with more than 10 years experience could override certain rules. So it enabled, basically provided a level of flexibility and enabling constraints in the system. So the key to that is, I think is absolutely right, that sometimes processes and systems, and they actually create an environment where people end up doing things that either going, why they're doing it. You have to zoom out of the individual and not zoom into the individual, zoom out to the environment in which they're operating and understand the context.
Thank you, Miriam. Peter, did you want to also come in?
Yeah, I think I think it's a fascinating question. What if the process itself is unethical or leads to unethical behavior? I mean, I think the short answer is that everybody in the organization must has a duty to act ethically, and Judith mentioned that earlier, and should have an ethical conscience, and things that are in conflict with their ethical conscience that they must raise, and the leaders must listen. I mean, I'll give you an example. Some years ago in the Netherlands, it's about 5 years ago, I believe, but the thing had been going on for some time. The government, the government, the Prime Minister actually resigns. So the government fell as a result of a scandal that involved social contributions given to families with children, where they could, by getting a contribution, get daycare for their children, or after school care. And there was it also meant that grandparents could get paid, if you like, to take care of the kids. There was some frauds in that, and as a result, there was legislation brought in to really be tough against that fraud. The tax ministry, which then was tasked with investigating these cases, followed a very, very strict line according to the legislation as to whether or not parents had correctly applied for this subsidy, and whether they had also kept all the receipts and all the paperwork. And when they found cases that looked suspect, then they went and investigated. And parents who had done something incorrect had to pay back not only the incorrect amount, but the entire amount that they had received over how many years for their kids. And it could be like 50,000 euros, which for many families is a life-changing sum of money. And although it was made clear that this was leading to some strange and undesirable outcomes, the people in the tax ministry who were investigating felt that they were constrained to apply the law as it had been written, and that they had to do this, that it was this almost a kind of following orders or following process despite everything else type of ethos. And anyway, in the end, it all came out. There was a big investigation. The Prime Minister had to resign because it was felt the government as a whole was responsible for this. So it was really a big deal. And in the end, the parents did get the money back. But of course, in the meantime, many had suffered extreme hardship. And for me, it's a fantastic story of how you must, in any process, be acting ethically, and there must be a way of escalating that. And leaders, because in this case, leaders in these ministries did know what was going on, they then must act ethically in changing the process and allowing it to continue.
Thank you, Peter. I'm very relevant in the current jurisdiction. I'm just looking at time. As we look to close this series of our focus on culture, might I invite each of you to offer one reflection, one practical concluding reflection on culture for the audience that perhaps we haven't discussed yet, that you'd like to leave them with. And Judith, I'm going to ask you, then Peter, and then Miriam, please.
Sure, thanks, Laurie. So my takeaway that I'd like to share is around pushing for organizational justice. What this looks like is where you see behavior that is substantiated as being unethical through any investigations you've had, take the time to build your processes so you are fair when you see behavior that is wrong. That way, you've done the homework of establishing the thresholds, and you're able to convince your leadership, your management about why you're taking decisions that you do. It builds confidence. Whatever your culture is, when there's organizational justice, when things have gone wrong, it builds employee confidence. So I'd say look at your processes on the back end so it's defendable to your stakeholders.
Peter?
So really, this is addressed to ethics professionals, also lawyers, others in this space. Really take time to spend time with people working in the front line of the activity that you're doing. Try and spend a day or half a day with somebody who's working on the interface between the organization and the outside world. So when I did country visits, when I worked for Novartis, for a pharmaceutical company, by far the best time that I spent was actually with the sales reps, going and visiting doctors and hospitals, and just watching what they were doing and listening to them about the dilemmas that they faced, the situations that they were in. What for me it surfaced was that there were a lot of things that people were doing without realizing that they weren't really meant to do that. There was a lot of unconscious, I don't want to call it misconduct, but you know, not quite what was expected. And it helped me understand that there are certain things which should be dilemmas, but people are kind of ignoring because they don't realize that that they should maybe think twice before doing it, because it's kind of in their routine. And those things that have become baked into people's day-to-day routine, that they're potentially the most dangerous, because you'll have an awful lot of people doing the same thing without realizing that it could potentially get the organization into trouble. So please try and spend some time with people in the front line, and it's just also from a human perspective really, really rewarding to do that.
Thank you, Peter. Miriam?
Thank you. So from the shoes of, if I'm trying to stand in the shoes of global ethics and compliance leaders, and given how I define culture around, what is it that we should pay attention to? I think there are blind spots in every organization, and they're often characterized by individuals operating under pressure of short-term targets, uncertainty, and conflicts of interest, where we've told people to follow the rules and given them an incentive not to. So whatever method you adopt in measuring culture and where you start in your organization, seek out these areas to understand first. To Judith's point earlier, if you don't understand the problem, it's very difficult to design the solutions.
Thank you, Miriam. So with that, I don't see any further questions in the chat. So I will firstly and foremostly thank you all as our panelists for participating in today's EY Integrity Agenda, our series of webinars focused on thematic areas of interest. And I trust the richness of the experience, the best practices, the case studies, and the discussion has been valuable. In the event you have any further questions, please do make contact and we'd be happy to revert. Judith, Peter, Miriam, thank you very much on behalf of EY and the audience for today's session.
Thank you.
Thank you.